Okay. Hello. I'm doing my pre-taped lecture for B74, the Body in Literature and Film. This is going into the fourth week. The texts on hand today, primarily Freud's essay on the Uncanny, the short story The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann, and the 1957 Hollywood movie, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So first, a note about the common denominator of what we've been doing so far, plus an acknowledgement that we're pivoting from organizations of the female body to organizations of the male body. In The Sandman, we'll see with the construction of Olympia for Nathaniel's gaze, there would appear to still be some kind of configuration of how the female body is put together. But now we see it, especially in The Sandman, through the lens of a kind of requirement for the male body to configure itself with a myth of wholeness and of integrity and of all of the parts combining to create a perfect, holistic, remainderless holistic, as Lacan has called it. But there is no such thing. There's no such thing for anyone. There is the human body, and there's human consciousness. And human consciousness tries to conceive of the body as an integrated whole and has various strategies for doing that. What we have looked at so far, I think, we've been emphasizing gender performance a lot, because the female body is put under the strictures of expectations of very much of performance. And it's a performance that permits the holistic mythology of the male body being complete. And this sets up a basic impossibility, and we see that happening over and over again in The Sandman. So what is the uncanny? I mean, maybe we can, start with that. The uncanny is the home-like and the unfamiliar. So the uncanny seems to occur when there is a setup between what we see as unfamiliar, but what we feel as something we know. So eerie would perhaps be better than fear or horror or terror. There's a specific, and not all things that are horrifying are uncanny, or not all things terrifying are uncanny. So what has to be in line for it to be uncanny? So as I've just said, it's a kind of our scopic regime, our the way we've become used to viewing things, very much codes something as unfamiliar, as something we've never seen before, and yet there's something about it which we don't recognize so in conscious terms so much, that is uncomfortably familiar. So the uncanny is, especially in The Sandman, but in general, it's often coordinated with concepts of the devil. So you run into somebody who's like somebody else or you run into somebody who seems similar to you. So there's a doubling with the uncanny. And one reason that the doubleness may be so uncanny, finding shadow figures, is that they too threaten to remind you of the incoherency that lies at the base of your constructed myth of bodily coherence. Lacan tries to explain it with the mirror stage, where the disorganized body that a child, an 18-month-old child roughly, greets its own reflection and wishes to mistake the coherency of the reflection as both proof and equivalency of the coherency of the body. And then they look for some kind of authentication. So they look for a gaze. So there's the child, the mirror, and then the gaze of the other, which Lacan gives a giant zero, a big zero, and a capital O, which is typically conceived of as the mother, but it can be any benevolent or malevolent gaze that is allowed to stand in the position of what either authenticates or threatens to eradicate your misrecognition of your own coherency by insisting that the coherency of their reflection is equivalent to a myth of coherency about the body. So that's a kind of a fatal misrecognition. We all make it. It's not a mental illness. It's a way of constructing ourselves. The difficulty as we move from the male body to the female body is that the male body has put considerable pressure on ideas of femininity, striving to promote a performance from the female body that also helps keep away the uncanny sense that the male body is actually still disorganized, however much we've imposed an integrity. So there was an artist named Hans Bellmer, operated in 1930s in Berlin, German, who was heavily influenced by the Sandman, and his whole career became a series of puppets. I'll show you one. They're uncanny in almost any way you might construe. So this is called the puppet. Now, clearly, Bellmer was influenced to some degree by Olympia, by the depiction of Olympia. So this it would appear to be a female body, and it's obviously in part. You'll notice the eye has a central focus. It's a focalizing point, and there's legs, there's a head, there's a torso. He has done several, and I may incorporate this into your next prompt, but I'm just going to show you this one for now. And there seems to be an implicit violence in that image. It's not just uncanny, but it's disturbing. And given that he was influenced by the depiction of Olympia, we realized that what's disturbing about this is it's really not a depiction of the female body. It's a depiction of the male urge to reorganize the female body so that it will somehow support his misrecognition of his own body as coherent. So a lot of misogyny, a lot of attempts to want to control the woman's body, the current renewed debate about abortion. If you go deep with it's not, I'm not going to say it's not about abortion. It obviously is, but it's also very much about control. And if we just decontextualize abortion for a moment, the concern is, do women what degree, or should it be legal for women to control their own bodies? And obviously in the case of pregnancy, there's a merging there that's also kind of uncanny in the sense that a pregnancy is connected to the male body through the impregnation. Forget the legal stuff of who's the father, who's the mother, and so on. A child does not begin gestation without that male contribution. So it's a very uneasy. A pregnant woman is in itself, from a male perspective, can appear as almost uncanny, in that something that the male contributed is now an intrinsic part of something that's not in the male body, but is related to the male through DNA and any number of connections. So to some degree, the desire to control women's reproduction, because it goes beyond abortion, is that whether the birth control pill should be available and at what age, and fights over sex education in school, and even the idea of should teenage girls be vaccinated against various viral diseases of the cervix, and even that can raise the issue of, well, those are diseases that these teenage girls will only encounter if they have sex. So if we give them a vaccination, we're encouraging them to have sex. There's this kind of insistence that without control, the female body will spiral off in directions where it will no longer be capable or fit for a kind of something that stands over against the mythical coherency of the male body. So in Sandman, this is, by the time we get to Olympia, this seems to be fairly explicit. And one of the many doublings, of course, is Clara versus Olympia. Clara is more or less his fiance. He has a kind of on again, off again relationship with her. And if you look at the way he treats Clara and what happens to him when he sees Olympia, Clara maintains, and she's not doing this on purpose, but she maintains an alterity. There's something about Clara that makes it clear that she's not only she's not a reflection of him, and not only is she not even just a reflection of him, she's not very reflective of him at all. I mean, he which is not a criticism of her. He's a very neurotic guy. I mean, he's kind of a male. It's funny that Freud also tries to reorganize Dora's body and the symptomatology, the remainders that Dora keeps showing that she can't fit into this construction of her body as a kind of bartering chip among her father and Hans K, and then by implication Mrs. K and her own mother, that she's been thoroughly bartered by all four of these adults for four very different reasons. But the one thing all these reasons have in common is it requires her to become a point of exchange, a point of transfer that essentially eclipses and attempts to eradicate any claim she might have to her own uniqueness apart from this transactional position she's been kind of forced into. So Freud's not so different than Hans Bellmer in that regard. I mean, Dora, in a sense, and Freud will say this sort of is the body before the symbolic order it constructs it and organizes it. And so to him, an hysterical woman is a woman who's in parts, somewhat like this. But also remember Sylvia Plath, the applicant, where she makes it much more clear that this woman has been put together and is referred to as it, and it come out of the closet. It can sew, it can this, it can that. Will you marry it? And it's, I don't know if how much Plath knew Hoffmann or Olympia, but it certainly taps back into that the perfect woman is kind of has no existence apart from the way she's organized to support the mythology of masculine coherence. And there is definitely an implied violence to that. And if you go back and look at your first prompt and look at the covers of Cosmo, you might well also see a kind of gentle, for want of a better word, attempt to create an Olympia, like every cover. And the discourse that's pasted all over the cover of Cosmo is attempting to enforce a specific reconfiguration onto the female body. But it creates what Plath calls, my perfect white's unbreakable self in her poem In Plaster. And the old yellow one is, because it's denied, rendered invisible, eradicated, eclipsed, but not gone. It can't be gone, because as Plath will also say later in her poem The Edge, the woman is perfected, her dead body wears a smile of accomplishment. So the perfect woman is a woman whose old yellow self has essentially died, so that the reconfiguration can take place and become stabilized. And we see that in the death of Eve Black and Eve White, which are necessary for Jane, who's also an alias, to be the stabilized configuration, who then can be placed in the car next to this husband. I guess we did see him earlier. They courted, and then she was afraid to marry him, but now she can, which kind of, and segues to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is made around the same time as The Three Faces of Eve, 1953, 1957. This era, there's a certain uncanny gothic domestic terror going on in the United States. That's reflected in so many movies. The Fly would be another one I could have shown. But about masculine anxiety, about being dismembered, and in the resulting insistence that women's performance become much more tightly choreographed, and any remainder that is the result of that tight choreography is denied, cut away, or tranquilized, literally, with the upsurge in first Milltown and then Valium. And that gets presented as a way to, as I think I showed you in one of those ads, we can't set her free, but we can help her cope, is the slogan for a tranquilizer, which literally shows the poles of various brooms and dust mops as the bars of a jail cell in front of a distressed-looking housewife. This is a perfect example of a lot of what this class is trying to do. How do you rise above the hegemonic discourse that makes conceiving of alternative realities literally unthinkable? Why can't she be set free? That's simply stated as a given and then passed over. The patriarchy can't set her free without expense to itself. And so it's hardly a surprise that the women's movement, which arguably at least made the attempt to free her palpable, was in no way begun or supported by patriarchal culture. It was at the expense of patriarchal culture. So we have the doublings in the Sandman, and what we also get as we watch the lifespan of Nathaniel is this recurrence of a trauma, which seems to then inaugurate a repetition compulsion on his part. And so he sits around his family dinner table. Everything is idyllic on most evenings, but every now and then the mother will indicate it's going to be one of those evenings because Coppelius, a kind of obnoxious figure for Nathaniel, will be arriving to consult with Nathaniel's father. And this is where Hoffmann's particularly good at this, where it's quite possible that not unlike the way Dora tries to relate things, there are actual events. There probably was this disagreeable guy that used to come over on a regular basis, and maybe there was business tensions and financial tensions, and the mother kind of registered that, and the father registered that. And it does seem they're rather beholden to this guy for their well-being, and it could have been nothing. Literally, it might have been nothing more than a financial well-being. But how does the young boy, in this case Nathaniel, what does he do with that anxiety, with that unease? And what Nathaniel tends to do is correlated with an anxiety and an unease that he's already feeling, which is what is it that stabilizes him? Obviously, family life is something you look to for something to stabilize you. So if something comes in that has a vague, it's a vague threat to the family structure you look to stabilize yourself, it can escalate and it quickly into something very, very frightening for a child, whereas it might just be annoying or aggravating or concerning for the adults. So that may be the actual events that happen with Nathaniel. But what Nathaniel thinks he sees is that, and Freud's point, which most readers of the story have borne out, is that we can look at Nathaniel's father and Coppelius as the split experience of Nathaniel of his own father. So there's the father at the dinner table who's relatively kindly and stable and predictable, and then the implication is that there is no Coppelius. There is a violent father unpredictable, one who disrupts and abandons the domestic scene. Hoffmann's father, in fact, left when he was around 4 and essentially was not a part of his life. So there's a straightforward autobiographical feature here. But the way it gets depicted is, and one can imagine a father with a drinking problem, for instance, which we can't point to specifically in the story, but how would a child make sense of an alcoholic father who on one occasion is drunk and threatening, and on another occasion is, say, contrite and reassuring, and yet they seem to emanate from the same body. And this happens with the mother too, but what, as we shift over to looking at the stresses of the myth of coherency relative to the male body, and as reflected in the behavior and choices of so-called masculinity, and lately we have this phrase, toxic masculinity, which does seem to be some attempt to point that an unexamined insistence on a certain configuration of masculinity can poison the environment. Most often women who are involved with the man who's engaged in toxic masculinity, because masculinity turns toxic when it feels threatened or challenged. So the difference between, say, masculinity and toxic masculinity is probably related to the degree of self-awareness the man has, that there's a difference between culturally preferred expressions of masculinity and femininity, and some kind of existential essential, that they're not the same. Because if you think it's the same, if you think the coherence of your masculine performance is inextricable from your existence, you're going to be on the spectrum of toxic masculinity to less toxic. You're going to be the most toxic because there's no wiggle room there. In that point, the male gaze is dismembering of the female. It is attempting to cut her up in order to reassemble her. And that the Hans Bellmer point that I just showed you. To give you a somewhat less visceral example, and to stick with Barbara Kruger, a graphic artist that we've already seen, "Your body is a battleground," kind of slogan of this class. Here's another Barbara Kruger, which he actually designed for a billboard. We don't need another hero. And you have a kind of Norman Rockwell moment of sorts with the cute girl with the pigtails is leaning over to look at the boy who's flexing the muscle, which already probably is some imitation of something he's seen in a Hollywood Western, or The Incredible Hulk, or Captain America, or any other, all these Marvel superheroes. But what I would draw your attention to here is how much the body is involved. So the boy is already channeling some mediated image of what it means to be a man. He's not a full-grown adult male, so he's already imitating a kind of posture, and the girl's already being encouraged to notice difference here, like that he's making a muscle, and she's got touching it with her finger, and instead of saying, "Oh, look, here's my muscle," she's already being taught to see the male body as having something extra, something that her body doesn't have. And this revolves around what Freud called the castration complex, which is easily misunderstood on a lot of levels. But the castration complex, for our purposes, and maybe for the Sandman, for instance, is Nathaniel has these two views of his father. And why is that second view so violent? And in fact, when he sneaks into the room to see the violent father, and the violent father finds him, the father prepares to, he actually unscrews his hands and legs, we're told. So he literally takes apart Nathaniel's body, at least in Nathaniel's sort of psychological reflection of it. But what he really wants is the eyes, and the good father has to beg him to not take Nathaniel's eyes. And there are a lot of places we can go with this, but just to make the point, the eyes are central to the mirror stage. When you look at, you see a reflection, which is then reflected back to you. So to lose your eyes in a kind of psychological, allegorical sense of things would be to lose the capacity to misrecognize your unified image as an equivalency, an authenticator of the myth of your own coherence. So the eyes are seen as something that would be terrible to lose. Now, the way this gets mapped out on the difference between the male body and the female body goes straight to genitalia, where male genitalia has an appendage that female genitalia does not seem to have the equivalent of. There was a time where the female anatomy there was an attempt to see it as an inversion of the male anatomy, so that everything that was an appendage in the male was tucked away in the female, to the point where the uterus could be viewed as the scrotum, and the vagina as the penis, but it was all turned inside out. But that, in a sense, rendered the female anatomy as nothing more than a kind of impression of the male anatomy. It was a recasting. It was sort of a plaster cast of male anatomy, which then gives the woman no separate anatomy except something that is a kind of reflective casting of the male anatomy. So the male anatomy, however you cut it, however you slice it, the male anatomy there's an attempt to keep presenting it as the holistic form, as the primary form, as the original form. And as I think I've mentioned, this is in Genesis as well, where Adam's created first, formed out of clay, in quote unquote in God's image, and then Eve is a rib that's bent into shape. So there's already that sense of the female as a derivation of the male body, and not having an independent formation. And if she's in God's image, it's God's image once removed. She's in God's image only in the sense that she's made out of a part of something else that was made in God's image. And then this difference can be assigned to male versus female genitalia. But so what's castration anxiety, or the castration complex? Castration anxiety, in this sense, is not so much the literal fear of having your anatomy cut, as it is the phobia of encountering, having experiences that threaten to, and typically uncanny experiences, to reveal the degree to which your sense of your own bodily integrity is a myth of coherency. So the encounter with his father and Coppelius would have been maybe the first encounter of a kind of castration anxiety, and where something will be cut, the eyes in this, we're told, but that will kind of make the male body fall apart like a puppet whose strings have been cut. And so when there is the reappearance of another figure who seems like Coppelius in his university days, there is again a kind of but somewhat benign paternal authority figure and a destructive paternal authority figure. So the uncanny will keep producing these splits. And Olympia is to a certain degree a doppelganger of Nathaniel. I mean, she's not alive, as we figure out. She's not, in fact, a woman. So, and Nathaniel is seems to be the only person who seems to find this excess of humanity in her. The other students are saying, well, she looks nice, but it's weird. It's not dancing with her. It's weird. It's robotic. Her eyes are weird, and it's uncanny for them. She's not uncanny initially to Nathaniel, because I think he's so anxious to find an arrangement of female anatomy that reassures him of the coherency of his own, that he's willing to infuse her with a fantasy of profound humanity which is really just a projection from him. So the scientist is seems to be a more benevolent father figure, and Coppelius, as usual, will disrupt the coherency, and so the bad father is a disruptor. The bad father provokes castration anxiety of various kinds, not least of all the boy who covets his mother's attention and perhaps resents the place that his father has in his mother's life, especially when that interferes with what he sees as a necessary attention. That can be felt by the boy's hostility toward the father, and because the father is so much more capable and powerful than the boy, there's a kind of concern that well, he could punish me for these thoughts I'm having, that I wish he were around less, or I wish he would not come in the room when my mom's reading me a book, and say, where's dinner, or something like that, and have the mother say, oh, to the child, let's say, oh, well, let's finish this book later. I mean, I'm just making up a scenario, but you can also see where the imposition of gender roles on a husband and wife, on a mother father, registers on the child as a kind of sort of a warfare for how it can attract or sustain the attention of the mother or the father. And at some point in the growth of the boy, this contradictory, almost paradoxical concern starts to emerge, that I'm so anxious to merge with my mother that it can suddenly turn the other way, and instead of that being reassuring, it starts to feel like engulfment and suffocation, and being sort of somehow drawn back into the womb, which is both attractive and horrifying to the developing boy. So cutting the apron strings, which has a castration implication, not being a mama's boy, all these kind of developmental milestones that boys are supposed to make are implied in that. But not unlike Dora's mother, the mother's not given a huge role. So Olympia is preferred immediately to Clara, and when Olympia falls apart, Nathaniel falls apart, and he goes back home and is more or less patched up by his mother and by Clara, and then he goes back for the denouement, the final dissolution, and you'll notice that that all of his fits of insane incoherency seem to be brought about by the telescope. So the telescope is already phallic shaped, and remember I mentioned the letter opener in Three Faces of Eve. That so the phallus is actually detachable. I mean, the metaphor that the male genitalia is used to underwrite. Obviously, male genitalia is attached, but the metaphor, the phallus, and most Lacan and Freud, they make this distinction, the penis being something anatomical, and then the phallus being a symbolic construct based on the presumption of what the penis endows you with. So castration anxiety really relates much more to the phallus, and that's where there's a lot of confusion about, our men just walking around with a word about being physically cut, and that's not really the case. They're worried about not living up to the promises of the phallus, because the phallus is detachable. It's not part of the male anatomy. It simply uses male anatomy to endorse itself. So you could think of it as being cut off from a source of power. Obviously, the phallic symbolism is used all the time in the patriarchal order to do kind of slide into this assumption that the authority that men try and claim is intrinsic to their biological structure. So then you become enamored of phallic structures, whether they're vast sports cars or tall buildings or guns or anything that particularly it's detachable, but if it can be used, it's shown to be powerful, bigger than other people's, more lethal than other people's, then you're basically fighting this castration complex war. So the telescope is kind of this um, a way to show that what's and notice, as I mentioned before, that Dr. Luther runs out of the room whenever Eve grabs the phallus, the sits in a chair and so on. So it's always when he looks through the telescope that what he really sees when he looks through the telescope is the degree to which his performance as a coherent male body is a structure. But because he can't handle that, it's through the telescope that he's able to see that Olympia's a doll. But that really gets back to the degree that he's what he refuses to see, which is that so much of his own gender performance is that he's a puppet, that his strings are being pulled. So the segue. So here's another Kruger to perhaps to show that it's one example of the chronic tension. You construct intricate rituals which allow you to touch the skin. If I got that right, to touch the skin of other men, and it's a picture of a bunch of guys roughhousing. Could be a bachelor party or hard to say, but. And this is associated with sports. And Barbara Kruger's comment is sports, for instance, is a way that men can be allowed to have a physical contact that's disallowed in a homophobic culture. So, even when you watch football, two men crash into each other, one helps the other up, they might even pat the other guy in the butt. So as long as you have the crash, the physical conflict, that opens up a space where you can actually pat another guy without that being immediately coded as a taboo attraction. So this is just one example, a particularly profound example, I suppose, of what as you move out from the intrinsic fear as a man that your body will fall apart like a puppet whose strings are cut. If the woman's performance is which is better performed if she's a puppet, isn't performed correctly, and this is just one example of the effect on that. And then I'll show you this last one. This is where you have a Kruger often used borrowed images. Like, so this is from a cartoon from the 50s of a man registering, a kind of a terror. But she's like, what's the price of keeping this terror at bay? And then she gives us a list. This is about the world in shambles. This is about looking for the moment when pride becomes contempt. In other words, proud of your integrity, proud of your coherence, but then something threatens it, and that very pride becomes the source of a contempt. So the pride turns inward and sustains the myth of coherency, which, when threatened, that same impulse of pride becomes the impulse of contempt. And the difference is if the other is not going to perform in a way that permits a masculine performance that is remainderless, then another possibility is to eliminate the other, blame the other, blame their failed performance. So a lot of domestic abuse, a lot of misogyny, violence toward women, rape, is this attempt to punish the other, in this case women, for refusing or failing to perfect their performance in such a way. And it's seen as bizarrely as justified because the man feels essentially threatened and assumes that it's in the woman's nature somehow. And this is what you get with the incels and those kinds of misogynistic groups, that to be a woman is to perform in a way that permits men to feel integrated. So a woman who doesn't do that is, first of all, unnatural, perverse, and this gets into the contempt for lesbian or transsexual and any kind of it's partly the contempt that comes from the pride of an integrated male for these for these different orientations, it's related to the male. It's not even contempt for this person is a lesbian. I have contempt for lesbians. It might be stated that way, but more accurate is I have a contempt for any woman who doesn't perform with the correct choreography, which ought to be natural to her. So there's no excuse for the woman. Like, if you don't do this, it can't be that, because that's not who you are. Because, you know, as we see with Plath, because there's other things you feel you are, and there's other things you want to do. It can't be any of that. It has to be that you're perverse or malicious. And the real problem, a whole nother problem too, is that men can go from an appreciation of women like Olympia, because she is so perfectly choreographed, again, to a contempt for the same woman, somehow missing out on, how could this woman that you loved because they made you feel so good is now somebody you hate. And I don't just mean breaking up with someone and it's not being able to work it out, but I mean wishing them harm in a way. Where's that violence coming from? There's nothing in the woman. It doesn't make any sense that a woman you loved is also a woman that deserves hatred and abuse. So there has to be more of a denial of the split inside the man, which might be another way for us to try and think about this, is that women are enculturated, as we see in Plaster, to the best of their ability, play with these two versions, the white unbreakable self, the Cosmo magazine image, and if you can, try and insinuate, try and give your old yellow self some place in that, but not to the point where a man would notice or feel threatened by it. But one way to kind of keep track of this is that women feel divided because men's division depends on them acting in a way that feels divisive for the woman. There's no way around it, even when you work with it, because there's often, since femininity is presented as a masquerade, there is a possibility of offering that masquerade even willingly as a woman, with the understanding that it's one of many iterations of you, who you can be. The problem seems to come up when the requirements of the male mythic coherency requires the woman to be frozen into a form of masquerade that might, in and of itself, might not be anathema to the woman. So, for instance, a woman might enjoy cleaning up a house and cooking a meal for her lover or husband who's coming home. That in itself isn't necessarily a problem. It's when that gets essentialized and naturalized, and then the next night, if she's studying or jogging, and that doesn't happen, and it's presented to her as failure, that's when you start. And the 1950s housewife is such a strict script. There was so much anxiety with the Cold War and the rise of McCarthyism and the fear of communism, which gives us the backdrop of invasion of the body snatchers. The principal couple, and for those of you in my romance class, I would need a longer class to present this as a Hollywood romance. But if you all happen to be in that class, some of this may resonate, because you do have, like you do in a classic Hollywood romance, you have a couple that's trying to figure out how to fall in love, how to become a couple. But where it's different than the average Hollywood romance is both are divorced, and that point is made. They've both kind of come back to town. She said, "I've been in Reno," where you went because of the divorce laws back in the 50s. It was the easiest place to. It was easier to get a divorce in Reno, Nevada, than anywhere else. So couples would travel there, and they would stay there the requisite amount of time that Reno law required for them to announce that they were legally divorced, and they could come back from Reno with their divorce. And this is not a domestic, it's not a melodrama, it's not a romance. So that's just brought up, but it does point to they're already remaindered. They don't fit in this town, and just the fact that they're trying to form, that they're drawn to each other and seem about to become a couple, uh, is there's no way that's not going to be a problem, because if two divorced people come together to form a couple, it challenges the essentialism of marriage, which was divorce was still, compared to now, I think 20% maybe was a rate in the 50s, and that was rapidly escalating, especially in the post World War II era. So there's lots of ways to read this idea that these pods show up, and then there's this slow transformation until a person, you can't tell, and what the result is uncanniness. So these, in a way, the couple, the main couple in the movie, are experiencing this increasing uncanniness as the town submits to a severe conformity. And in this final scene where, she falls asleep and then her eyes open again, and then she's like, it's happened, it's changed, it's not so bad, you should do it too. And then he's out on the highway screaming, they're here, as trucks full of pods, which was meant to be the original ending. And in fact, the opening 5 minutes where we see him trying to convince them that these pod people are coming, and then we get the backstory, and then we return to where the authorities finally say, okay, I guess we believe you. This was added at the insistence of the studios. So if you lop off the beginning of the movie and lop off the scene where he's back, and you can even tell with the filming that it's very stagey, very in the offices, versus that visually very arresting image of the trucks rolling past and sweating and terrified and saying they're coming. So many 50s movies have what clearly looks to be the better open-ended ending. Those of you who heard me talk about Kiss Me Deadly, that movie too, the open-endedness of the atomic bomb exploding in the shack, and that's another 1950s Cold War. And you could do a whole class on 1950s Cold War movies, which is not what I'm doing at the moment. So that's how I'm trying to position Invasion of the Body Snatchers in this larger context. But there's also doubling in Invasion. So and uncanniness. In this case, the double is the culturally demanded in tandem gender performance, which can be constricting to both the man and the woman. If any of you guys watched the series of Mad Men, which was an attempt to go back to this 1950s era, or even a novel that came out of it called The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, there is a kind of be careful what you ask for, because the women were constrained into tightly choreographed gender performances, but so were the men, and felt trapped in it in a different way. What one of the ways to get around it for the man at that time, because it was vaguely culturally condoned, was to have a mistress or a lover, have a woman outside, so that they could both. And a way to deal with the split is have the woman who is outside of the constraints of the choreographed union, so that you can stay inside the choreographed union. And to a degree, there was a lot of allowance given the men at this time, having and The Great Gatsby, of course, would be the prime example where Tom doesn't seem to have any problem with having a woman, Muriel, that he puts up and goes to party with and takes Nick to go see, even though Nick is Daisy's cousin. Anyway, kind of an aside, but So I don't want to go on too much longer here. These pre-taped, I don't want to take more time than really to elaborately uh, set the table. So I'm going to try. I think I'm going to be designing another prompt for you guys, which isn't due Tuesday night, but you can get started on it. And I think it'll have to do with Kruger and Bellmer and some of these ideas about how uncanniness. It's funny how uncanniness doesn't seem to be the default place of discomfort for the woman who's being encouraged to masquerade. Because even with Plath, it's she recognizes in many of those poems, including Daddy, that the uncanniness is coming out of the paradox of the masculine position of having to deny a split that the women are encouraged to suppress. And there's a difference between suppressing a split like Old Yellow versus Unbreakable White Cell, and being told that any awareness of that split, if you're a man, is a mental breakdown, which can, so that men aren't, in a way, aren't allowed to be hysterical. They aren't allowed to be in pieces. They aren't allowed to openly debate the exhausting tension of trying to choreograph the split between their actual continued lack of holistic integration, and then their performance as presumably whole. So let me pause it there for you guys. And Tuesday, 6:30, I'll open the link. We will talk some more. So read The Uncanny, read Sandman, and watch Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and I'll see you so we can talk about it live. Okay, bye for now.